Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Before introducing the webinar, I'd like to say a few words about BD Canada. BD has been a corporate member of the college, Canadian College of Health Leaders, since 2005. And in 2008, together with the college and BD, introduced the Excellence in Patient Safety Award to the National Awards Program. BD Canada is the exclusive sponsor of this award, which recognizes individuals or teams that are committed to improving patient safety practices in healthcare. Also in 2008, the college recognized BD Canada for their commitment and dedication to Canadian health leadership by presenting them with the college's President Award for Outstanding Corporate Membership. In continuing our terrific relationship, we have partnered to offer this webinar today, and the objectives of which are to review the COVID-19 epidemiology and health system impact, to share BD Canada capabilities to support COVID-19 response, to discuss the importance of coordinated efforts, local, provincial, and national. Our presenters today from BD include Dr. John Llaguno, Medical Director, Jennifer Pannunzio, Strategic Marketing Director, and Chelsea Smallwood, Associate Director of Health Economics and Public Policy. So up first is John Llaguno, Medical Director. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for participating today. I'm John Llaguno, BD Canada's Medical Director, and I'm accountable for patient safety. BD is a global healthcare organization advancing the world of health. And over the next 10 slides, my goal is to bring to life the epidemiology of the COVID-19 virus and its impact to healthcare systems around the world, including Canada. Next slide, please. To begin and level set, on December 31st, 2019, the World Health Organization's country office in China was informed of cases of pneumonia of unknown etiology detected in Wuhan City, Hubei province. For us here in Canada and many people around the world, thousands of kilometers away, the outbreak that began in a seafood and poultry market seemed distant and of minimal to moderate concern. However, 6 months ago to the day, it became very real. On January 21st, or January 25th, 2020, a man in his 50s who arrived in Toronto from Wuhan, China, became the first presumptive case in Canada and was placed into isolation in Toronto's Sunnybrook Hospital. Next slide, please. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic March 11, 2020. Its global impact as of June 24th has resulted in almost 9.4 million cases worldwide and almost 500,000 deaths. Its impact here in Canada as of June 23rd has resulted in over 100,000 total confirmed Canadian cases, 8,500 deaths, 2.5 million Canadians tested, and 65,000 Canadians have recovered. To put the COVID-19 Canadian mortality rate of 8,454 deaths into perspective, as per Statistics Canada in 2018, influenza and pneumonia combined killed 8,511 Canadians. When you narrow the scope to just the common flu, the death toll is approximately 500 to 1,500 Canadians. So you can see the impact of COVID year to date. Next slide. By now, we're all aware that COVID-19 is mainly transmitted through droplets generated when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or exhales. An infection may occur by breathing in the virus through close contact or by touching a contaminated surface and then your face, eyes, nose, or mouth. On the right-hand side of the slide is the comparative reproductive rate of COVID-19 against other viruses. The reproductive rate is the average number of people that one person with the virus infects. Initially in February, the preliminary reproductive rate for COVID-19 was estimated to be between 2 to 2.5 people. In comparison to the seasonal flu's reproductive rate of 1.5 to 1.9, COVID-19 is highly contagious. Currently, Canada's reproductive rate now hovers around 1. In some jurisdictions in Canada, less than 1, but higher in other countries. For example, Germany's reproductive rate in May was 0.75, and of Sunday, June 21st, their reproduction rate was reported at 2.88. a concerning increase because this becomes harder to isolate and flatten the curve. Next slide, please. So flattening the curve, you may have seen this graph in numerous publications called Flattening the Curve. This graph shows a tall, narrow curve and a short, wide curve. Through the graph is a horizontal line that shows how many sick, critical patients in a Canadian hospital, a province, or a country can treat. The tall curve in blue goes above the line. That means too many people are sick at one time. The implications for a hospital, province, and to Canada is we won't have enough hospital beds or resources for all the people who will need treatment. The flatter curve in yellow extending to the right shows what happens if the spread of the virus slows down. The same number of people may get sick, but the infection happens over a longer span of time, so hospitals can treat everyone. The aim is to reduce overall infections and keep cases at a number that healthcare systems can manage, therefore flattening the curve. Next slide. Let's take a look at COVID-19 testing. There are two types of tests, diagnostic tests and antibody tests. Currently, there are two types of diagnostic tests, one of which is the most common and approved here in Canada that I presented in front of you today. So across Canada, broad-based diagnostic testing is available through nasopharyngeal PCR testing, which is a diagnostic test that detects the virus genetic material. At present, PCR tests gives us a good indication who is infected, and we can isolate the individual and get in contact with people they've been in touch with so they can quarantine. Next slide. Another diagnostic test is number 2, the antigen test. This test requires swabbing and instrumentation, providing results within minutes. These diagnostic tests quickly detect fragments of proteins found on or within the virus by testing samples collected from the nasal cavity. According to the CDC, these tests are very specific for the virus, but are not as sensitive as the molecular PCR test. Therefore, a negative result from an antigen test may need to be retested with a PCR test. And finally, on the right, another type of COVID-19 test is the antibody test, also known as serological test, either at the point of care or in the laboratory. Serological tests detect antibodies. An antibody tells us what proportion of the population has been infected. The key takeaway between the slide that I just covered and this slide is that PCR and antigen tests, number 1 and 2, reflects active infection and our diagnostic test, whereas serological tests, also known as antibody tests, reflect past infection. Next slide. Canada's curve compared to other nations, given that we just talked about testing and using the dogma, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We've selected 9 countries, Brazil, United States, India, United Kingdom, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, including Canada, to examine the growth of COVID-19 cases over time to help explain Canada's current situation and the effectiveness of our response. Not every country has reacted to the coronavirus pandemic in the same way. Some countries' healthcare systems have been hit harder than others. And for some, there are complex geographic, demographic, and political factors at play that may make one country more susceptible to surge in cases than another. Some countries, such as Japan, which you can see at the bottom, took immediate action to slow the spread of the coronavirus by isolating COVID-19 cases and restricting travel. Others, such as Italy, saw their healthcare system quickly overwhelmed, and the number of cases and deaths rose dramatically before they put effective measures in place. Next slide. So what are these effective measures countries put in place? Countries are responding worldwide by deploying various measures such as patient pathways, social isolation, communication channels, hospital and clinical capacity limits, staff deployment, contact tracing, and surveillance, just to name a few. Next slide. However, even with these aforementioned infection prevention and control measures, efforts were exacerbated by shortages of healthcare professionals, PPEs, and of vital supplies, not only for the acute care setting, but also for the alternate care settings. Next slide. My final comments. First, thank you to the healthcare leaders on the phone. Now, moving forward, as we in Canada move past the first COVID-19 wave, healthcare leaders like yourselves are left contemplating what the path into and through phase 2 and 3 will look like for your families, for your patients, for your healthcare providers, and for the communities that you live and serve. Decisions around how and when to de-isolate have not been made lightly and are complicated by the fact that every jurisdiction seems to have a different reproduction rate. To help make sense of these extraordinary times, the rest of the presentation will provide opportunities for reflection to better prepare for a potential second or third COVID surge while maximizing resources. So let me now transition the presentation to my colleague, Jennifer Pannunzio, BD Canada's Strategic Marketing Director. Jennifer?
Thanks, John. So I'm going to switch gears and highlight some of the capabilities that we have to support COVID-19 response, as well as share with you some of the lessons learned with health systems early on in this pandemic. Next slide, please. BD is deploying capabilities, expertise, and scale to address critical health needs related to coronavirus, including technologies that can be used to support research and development, diagnosing patients, treating patients, surveillance, as well as devices to administer vaccines. Let's start with discovery. Solutions, instruments, and data analysis platforms are integral to helping researchers deepen our understanding of COVID at a cellular level, specifically in clarifying our picture of the body's immune system response. Cell analysis and sorting technologies can support more detailed knowledge of immune system responses to help researchers have a stronger foundation to develop more effective therapies, as well as accelerate the path to developing a much needed vaccine. Looking at diagnostics and focusing on specimen collection, we've partnered with health systems to provide both swabs as well as UBT systems that are used to collect and transport clinical specimens for molecular viral testing, and included not only for the diagnosis of flu, but also coronavirus, as well as tubes and lancets that are used to collect blood samples that will be used for serology testing. Diagnostic testing is a main focus in Canada and around the world right from the outset of this pandemic. As Jonathan mentioned, there are a number of different types of tests, and I'm going to talk through some of the technologies that we have to support. Molecular testing platforms were placed in many Canadian facilities prior to COVID-19 and are now being utilized for COVID-19 testing across Canada. At the outset of the pandemic, we supported expedited installation of our analyzers in COVID-19 hotspots. Additionally, as we look to the future in diagnostic testing, we're working to expand those testing capabilities with point-of-care immunoassays for COVID-19 that are in development, as well as a partnership for a rapid serology test that is pending regulatory approval in Canada. It's really important for us at this time to be thinking ahead around how these tests will be utilized and the potential need for these technologies in Canada in the future. On the front lines in the crisis, we're helping physicians and nurses manage medications, more safely deliver drugs and treatment to patients, as well as support advanced healthcare needs in the ICUs and other acute care settings. These products are widely used outside of the pandemic. However, as we'll discuss, we've really seen an increased demand across acute care to support patients with these technologies. We can also help health systems with pathogen surveillance, that help to assess data on test results, drug inventory, hospital utilization trends, and more, to help form a picture of risk and responses. And as we look ahead to cautiously returning to normal, our technologies can help detect early warning signs of reemergence of the disease. Finally, as researchers move into clinical trials for vaccines, we're supporting health systems with necessary delivery devices to help meet the needs of a potential vaccine once it's developed. So as you can see across this pathway, we're continuing to support both current and future health system needs as it relates to responding to this pandemic crisis. Next slide, please. So let's discuss in more detail some of our more recent lessons learned around supporting patient management, specifically in ICU and acute care setting, as well as tracking and reporting of COVID-19 data. Next slide, please. So early in the pandemic, we worked really closely with provincial shared service and procurement bodies to support ICU and acute care surge modeling of our critical technologies to help estimate the requirements for additional supplies to treat patients that are admitted to the ICU with COVID. This included working collaboratively with regional task forces to determine appropriate quantities needed based on current and anticipated hospitalizations, as well as understanding the potential treatment pathways. As access to healthcare facilities is limited for our teams, we're really focusing now on adapting our clinical support of these critical products and procedures so that we can satisfy the demands of resource-constrained hospitals through virtual training as well as implementation efforts. And additionally, we facilitated movement and modification of existing automated dispensing cabinets from less critical to more critical areas where hospitals were having hotspot occurrences. Next slide, please. So some of our lessons learned through these engagements and collaborations with health systems is that we found that transparency between the health system and supplier was really critical to this process and should really include ongoing communication and touch points. As we engaged in these discussions across the country, it helped us to build an allocation strategy that included looking at current contracts as well as order history, phased in product approaches where necessary, as well as hotspot allocations so that we could support current crisis activities in Canada. And by being proactive and coordinating efforts, suppliers can effectively ramp up production and can closely monitor inventory and customer ordering so that we can ensure supply continuity. Next slide, please. So robust surveillance and data tracking are another key area we want to discuss. And it's really critical to have this data and information in order to provide analytics of COVID-19 and other pathogens to inform healthcare leaders as well as systems on what they might need to do and how to plan for the future. With what we really urge healthcare leaders to consider automated surveillance software technologies, because with automated surveillance, it would be possible to aggregate pharmacy, laboratory, as well as patient data to provide the following analytics at the health system or population level. It would allow for heat mapping and trends of both flu and COVID-19 testing, where positive and negative results by hospital and patient's home postal code could be determined. It can provide demographics of COVID-19 positive patients, so looking at age and gender and other demographics. It could allow for changes in hospital utilization and percent capacities to be measured, so we could have information by ER, non-ICU units, and ICU units. It could support information sharing around changes in medication ordered, so understanding the top meds ordered, again, by non-ICU or ICU units. And finally, it could support outcome reporting among COVID-19 patients, looking at things like readmission, length of stay, as well as the percent where we have escalated care. So in order to safely restart our economies, we really need both multifaceted testing capabilities, as we've discussed, as well as advanced disease monitoring capabilities. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Chelsea Smallwood, who will discuss the importance of coordination across local, provincial, and federal agencies.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Smallwood, and as mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of Health Economics and Public Policy for BD. And throughout the course of the pandemic so far, I've been responsible for liaising with the federal government as well as supporting discussions and planning within the provinces. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the need for coordinated efforts as we move into the next phases of the pandemic. Next slide. And so while I'll be focusing mostly on the intersection between the public sector and private sector, I did think that it would be important to really highlight the importance of mobilizing across all sectors to respond to the pandemic. In particular, really highlight the role of the nonprofit sector, particularly around non-government organizations and global relief agencies in supporting low and middle income countries, and critical importance of civil society as well, particularly as they emphasize public health measures. Next slide. And so the focus of my talk will be primarily around how we've been working with governments and global health agencies, and in particular, the need for coordination. And I thought I'd focus around 3 key areas: vaccination campaign planning, COVID-19 point of care tests, which my colleague John touched on briefly, as well as serological testing. And then I'll touch briefly on grant making and engaging on the front lines as well. Next slide. And so in working with governments, we've really been focused around 3 key areas: safeguarding operations, communicating capabilities, and mitigating capacity constraints. And safeguarding operations was really critical. As the pandemic started, we saw lockdowns happening across the globe. And with manufacturing operations in many, many countries, it was really critical that we enabled our employees to continue to work within our manufacturing plants. In Canada, we actually have a manufacturing plant based out of Quebec. And so it was essential that early on, we partnered with the Quebec government to ensure that our employees working in that plant were able to continue to be seen as essential workers. Some of the products manufactured in that plant are actually COVID-19 test assays. And so that was really critical. Communicating capabilities was also essential. And you heard a little bit about those capabilities from my colleague, Jennifer. Early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk around shortages with personal protective equipment and ventilators. And we really wanted to ensure that we were communicating early and were transparent about a number of other products that we felt would be essential for the treatment of patients with COVID-19, and that health systems were planning adequately and in advance of surge needs. And then finally, mitigating capacity constraints. As we think about all of the products that will be needed to continue to mitigate some of the risk with regard to COVID-19, a number of those products are not part of usual care. And so as you can imagine, we need to be planning much in advance for things like rolling out of vaccination campaigns in order to be prepared in advance and mitigate some of the capacity constraints with manufacturing. Next slide. So before I get into some of the more specific topics with regard to vaccination campaign planning, diagnostics, and serological testing, I thought it would be interesting to share a bit more about the geopolitical landscape that was sort of pre-existing before entering into this pandemic, but for which there's an intensification of some of those trends. The first being US-China relations. We know that those were tense coming into the pandemic, and the intensification there has really led to regionalization of manufacturing. And it's also exacerbated this US trend toward disengaging with global governance institutions, such as the WHO, for example. And really what this has led to is where they have previously taken the lead was sort of bringing countries together toward a common good. We're seeing countries now look more inward and sort of each one for their own. On top of that, before the pandemic, you know, there was sort of tense economic environment that was pre-existing and social tensions already brewing. And that together with nationalism and populism has sort of, again, been intensified. And the way that this is manifesting throughout the pandemic is, again, through more nationalism and seeing things like export restrictions. And for example, in the United States, as you may or may not have heard about this Defense Production Act, whereby the United States can seize medical products. And we saw an example of that with the 3M masks. And so really, it's really critical that as we continue to move forward through the pandemic, in particular, that countries work together to ensure the flow of goods in an open global supply chain. And we know that Global Affairs Canada is working really hard on this. Next slide, please. And so sort of digging into that supply chain, it's been, I think, really enlightening throughout the pandemic to really see the complexity of the supply chain. And so I thought just to share with you sort of some key learnings and the impact of some of these components of the supply chain as it pertains to the advantage of really being coordinated. And so if you start with raw materials, we know that raw materials can be sourced from all over the world. And acquisition of those raw materials really has an impact on manufacturing capacity. We saw examples of this with reagents, for example, for development of COVID-19 tests. And so access to those reagents and even the tubes that hold the reagents can really impact manufacturing capacity for those tests. As we move into the second phase, assuming that we can access the raw materials, is really around the sort of capacity of manufacturing that's existing today. And that really influences the global allocation of products. And, you know, an example of how it's important to really be transparent around manufacturing capacity and plan together with health systems are things like, again, I'm going to pick on diagnostic testing, is looking at testing capacity. So you could imagine that while you may have, you know, a number of instruments within your health system, that they may not be able to be run at full capacity, either because we have, you know, a shortage of test reagents or things like swabs. And so really thinking along the whole environment and along that supply chain is really critical to help for planning for public health, as well as communicating to the general public about what our goals are. And then the next phase, you know, once manufacturing is complete, you know, manufacturing happens all over the world, and Canada is a great importer of medical supplies. And so shipping is sort of the next hurdle to overcome. And as mentioned on the previous slide, you know, nationalism in the form of export restrictions can impact the flow of goods. And so all of this to say that it's really critical that we're coordinated. Next slide, please. And coordination can help with the accurate planning on the front end, but can also help, you know, protect Canada's goods and, you know, really help the federal government as they engage in international diplomacy. And what we're looking to do with this type of coordination is, you know, avoid any kind of competition that might arise within the country. So while it may not be the intent, you know, provinces are looking to supply and prepare for their own populations, but an unintended consequence of that could be that some provinces are over-prepared and some provinces are left behind. And I always like to kind of relate back to the example of toilet paper. Never thought I'd be talking about toilet paper in a webinar. But, you know, if you think about wanting to protect your own family at the beginning of this pandemic and stocking up on supplies of toilet paper, that left others, you know, without, and a shortage. And so, you know, the more advanced we can be in our planning, the more proactive to understand needs, you know, the better we'll all fare in the end. And so again, this coordination, both at the local, provincial, and in some cases necessary at the national level, can really help us both prepare for a result that's best for Canada as a whole, but also mitigate any future risk with regard to nationalistic actions by other countries. Next slide. And so I'll talk a little bit about how this coordination pertains specifically as we move sort of into the next phases of the pandemic. So talking about vaccination, again, point of care COVID-19 testing, and serological testing for COVID-19 as well. So next slide. So vaccines have been the topic as of late in the media. And a lot of the questions have been around, you know, which countries are going to get the vaccine, in what amount, and when. And that's really been the topic of the discussions to ensure that we have, you know, equitable marketing and distribution of the vaccine. But as you might be aware, these challenges are not limited to the vaccine itself. And so at the time that we have, you know, a successful vaccine candidate or maybe multiple successful vaccine candidates, there will be demand for really billions of injection devices, needles and syringes. And we know that that's an essential part of vaccine delivery. Every country will be demanding supply. And, you know, you can imagine that as a manufacturer of these devices, you know, we have an intent to not disrupt the normal use of these and routine vaccination campaigns as well. And so it's really critical that in order to mitigate any risk there, that we work proactively and work together with the government and ideally coordinated across the whole country to secure those supplies. And that's what we've been doing in Canada over the last few months to ensure that no provinces get left behind and enable the best approach to mitigate any future risk as nations become competitive in acquisition of those products. Next slide, please. So on the topic of sort of novel diagnostics that are being developed, point of care antigen tests, so those tests that my colleague John was referring to that can be completed in, around 10 minutes. They're in devices that can be held in your hand. We really need to think about how those fit within the testing algorithm of a country, and in Canada in particular. These types of tests could potentially alleviate the burden on labs, but because of their unique attributes, we know that demand could potentially arise from really unconventional settings, such as the airline industry or retail pharmacies. And again, since these are innovations that haven't been used yet for COVID-19 or in routine care, there will be limitations on manufacturing. And so as early as we can be thinking about how these tests fit within our testing algorithm, the better prepared we'll be to deliver the tests in the right setting for Canadians. Next slide. And serological testing. So that is testing looking at whether or not you've been previously exposed to COVID-19. You might be aware that there's a national immunity task force looking at the tests and determining the best course of action for deployment of those tests. But depending on how the tests are used, they could require very large quantities of both the tests, but also the sample acquisition devices, so blood collection in this case, at the same time. And so again, as with some of these other technologies that we've been talking about, it's really critical that we plan in advance. And unlike testing for COVID-19 as a diagnostic test, whereby we could sort of look to hotspots to see where the most fair allocation goes, we don't really know what the uses of these tests will be in an optimal setting. And so demand planning can be more difficult in that case. And so this is just another situation in which transparency and coordination can really be beneficial. And next slide. So that really completes the part of the talk focused on innovation and supply chain. I did want to touch quite briefly just on our activities regarding investments in partnering globally. We've invested financially in a number of different organizations. You can see an example of those on the slide, as well as partnered with others such as FIND and ASLM to ensure that we can bring awareness to COVID-19 and provide training resources in low and middle income countries. Next slide. And finally, just wanted to highlight that, the MedTech industry as a whole has been working together with our healthcare system to overcome many of the obstacles that we've been presented with throughout this COVID-19 pandemic. The situation has been quite unprecedented. And just wanted to take a moment to highlight our service engineers that have been installing and servicing medical instruments, as well as the fact that we're really proud of our clinically trained associates who have been volunteering in hospitals to support frontline patient care. And I think really importantly, and across the sector, we've been adapting to enable virtual capabilities to support your clinical and service needs. Next slide. So showing this slide again, and in closing, we just want to communicate those last comments around, where we've been successful in a smooth planning process has been where we've had early engagement, transparency, and coordination. We really hope that this session was helpful. I'd really like to take a moment to thank all of you for your contributions throughout these incredibly challenging times and appreciate your attention throughout this session. We welcome the continued collaboration, and I believe opening it up now for questions.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, Jennifer, and John. And I encourage the participants today to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And and I will moderate those questions. I posted in the chat box something that the panelists have asked you to share your thoughts on. So you can enter any thoughts you may have in the chat box, and I'll bring those up as they come in. And just for those, so you can start percolating for the participants, this is the question in the chat box. As you reflect on some of the key lessons learned that BD has shared today, how do CCHL members support breaking down barriers with industry partners for government? With industry partners and government. So sharing your thoughts online through the chat would be very welcome. I do have a question for the panelists. During this pandemic and as a global supplier, how are you sharing best practices around the world with Canadian health leaders?
Thanks, Brenda. So I can maybe start, and then I'll ask Chelsea to add, or John. So, you know, Chelsea, John, and I are all on global meetings regularly with our counterparts across the world. And so, you know, as it relates to COVID-19, we are sharing our learnings through different forums. And our intention is to really bring them to webinars to Canada like this. Additionally, we have webinars that BD Global is running that is available to any Canadian customer as well. So those are all different forums where we're hoping to share learnings across the globe.
Thank you.
Chelsea?
Yeah, I might just add in too, you know, throughout the pandemic, there have been a number of other forums that have evolved. And so, you know, BD and other private sector companies are part of a MedTech industry association. And they've been really great for setting up a number of forums with both the federal government, procurement side, but also with the Public Health Agency of Canada and the National Microbiology Lab. And this has been a really great forum to be able to both learn and share our insights as a company and globally.
Great, thank you. It sounds like you're very busy. Just looking at the slides and the work you've been doing. Wow, it's impressive. Second question, what is the ask of health leaders in supporting industry in order to prepare for potential next waves of this pandemic?
I think I can take this one to start since I spoke about it a bit. You know, I think a really helpful thing would be to invite industry partners to the conversation and as early as possible. You know, these forums have started developing, but I think the earlier that we could be there and considered and invited, that would make things a lot easier. I also think that, you know, of the topics that we sort of went through today, planning for how the testing algorithm might change with the economy opening up and, you know, looking to increase the number of tests that we're able to perform, I think would be helpful if that thinking and planning could start now.
Thank you.
John, Jennifer, anything else said?
I think you covered it well.
Yeah, and we have seen, it's interesting, Chelsea, in your response, because we have seen partnerships and collaborations happening very quickly, very seamlessly with people that have never worked together before. So I think including industry in that relationship, have you, and this is my own personal curiosity, have you felt that kind of collaboration sort of bubbling up? Have you seen some of that, or has that been a gap that you've noticed?
I can speak at least sort of from the federal government engagement level and what I've seen within the provinces. It has definitely improved considerably. I'd say the dialogue is certainly a two-way street and that's been really helpful. So I'd say keep it up. You know, and just thinking of that question, I have one more thing to add, just in terms of thinking through the next phases of the pandemic. I've seen some information come out now, but I think it'll be really helpful, especially from a public health perspective, to start educating the public around vaccinations and to start to tackle some of the skepticism around that. Just not really a BD thing, but I think this is a public health effort that we're all going to need to be engaged in. That was my 2 cents.
Okay.
I just have something to add to Brenda as it relates to your question there with, you know, we've seen definitely much more collaboration at the procurement, at the regional or health system procurement level. So working with regional pandemic task forces, procurement task forces to understand, you know, what products would be needed. As mentioned, we've worked to support surge demand required to treat ICU patients, as well as testing capabilities. And, you know, early on, we saw the value of that ongoing collaboration and having those regular touch points and open communication. It really helped us to inform our supply chain needs and as well as manufacturing, but then also make sure that we can supply hotspots as needed. So very critical and much improved collaboration for sure.
That's great to hear. There is a question here from Julia. It's, would the panelists please comment on the potential to develop Canadian manufacturing of medical and diagnostic supplies and equipment?
I can take that one. So in terms of diagnostic supplies, we actually do have manufacturing facility in Canada for that. You know, I think part of the challenge, and this is something that we were considering and thinking about early on in the pandemic, is that for many medical supply are quite technical and detailed. And so setting up new manufacturing can be quite difficult, right? Unlike with, you know, some things like masks, perhaps, where you can sort of set up 3D printing and that, you know, developing manufacturing lines for diagnostic instruments can be quite difficult. But I do think that it is something, you know, to consider as we move forward and in pandemic preparedness for future possible pandemics, as well as, you know, what manufacturing can be accomplished in Canada.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I was speaking with a senior leader from the Canadian Armed Forces or doing a webinar, and he mentioned the need for redundancy. And we always think of redundancy as sort of a bad thing, and you know, you want to streamline processes and systems, but this pandemic has really highlighted almost the need for redundancy in some ways. Yeah,
and I think it sort of goes back to that sort of new geopolitical order. I think, you know, depending on how the elections go this year in the US, that will also kind of determine, you know, how necessary things like that are, you know, and how well countries can continue collaborating and keeping the flow of goods open, which I think, you know, there's quite a push for diplomacy, supply chain diplomacy especially. And so it'll be interesting to keep abreast of that.
Yeah. From Albert, he's asking, who decides what technology from BD is purchased by hospitals? Albert works at a hospital in the GTA.
So we work with the traditional procurement avenues. So your shared service organizations, as an example, if we're in the GTA, would be accountable for procuring technology. So where existing contracts were evident or were available prior to COVID, those were leveraged. And then there were forums as well in each provinces whereby the provincial governments, you know, had a call out for specific technologies and capabilities related to COVID that many vendors like BD as well as smaller companies would have responded to. And so then there was kind of collaboration at the government level as well as at the hospital procurement level. I don't know if I specifically answered your question, but it definitely varied. There was actually more pathways for procurement during this COVID than what we would see traditionally.
Interesting.
Chelsea, anything to add there?
You covered it.
Okay.
Another question here from Elaine asking, what does the federal government need to do to improve supply chain nationally?
I think Chelsea should take that one.
I could try and take this one. So I think depending on, you know, what part of the supply chain we're talking about, you know, I think as much as we can be coordinated with the provinces and territories, that's helpful from our end. You know, I know that there was some discussion early on about, you know, looking for new ways to manufacture some of these critical products. And I think where Canada has, you know, something to offer is actually geared toward the raw material capacity And so I think that that would be interesting to take a look at, you know, where we could be supporting the raw material end of that supply chain, so that we're not sort of double dipping into the same raw materials by trying to have, you know, more manufacturing of, you know, one type of supplies. So if I can share the example, I think it was either masks or ventilators, and sorry, I can't recall, but, you know, it was, if you add another manufacturing capacity to Canada, we're still dipping into the same raw material sort of pool. And so I think we have strength in that sort of upfront piece as Canada. I don't know if that specifically answered the question, but.
That's helpful. Lots to think about. And the question is, so reversing how, you know, how can we break down collectively some barriers between health leaders in Canada and industry partners and government? What are your thoughts?
You want me to take that one?
Yeah, Chelsea, you want to take that? I have some thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really helpful during COVID. I think we've seen this come to light, that when you have a common interest, right? How do we protect Canada during a pandemic? I think it makes it easier for us to come to the table. You know, I think the urgency has contributed to that as well. And so I think moving forward, you know, acknowledging that, you know, companies like ours exist because we have technologies that we think are helpful. And, you know, being able to articulate and come together in that middle ground, I think could be, you know, the way forward to sitting at the table, but also being open to, you know, we might not always have the perfect language to facilitate that conversation, but how do we start to get there? And so sort of opening the door to it, I think, is a good first step.
I like that.
Any thoughts from my colleagues?
I think being engaged early on in terms of planning and even supporting, you know, as I'll give an example with surge planning for the ICUs. So thinking about all the supplies that are outside of ventilators and PPE we would need to support those additional patients in the ICUs. We looked at how can we support through modeling? How can we help hospitals understand what their anticipated requirements would be for specific items, like even down to catheters and things that are consumables that are going to be used by these health systems. And, you know, it was a great opportunity to have that dialogue if we were brought to the table early. And in some cases, you know, there were systems that were looking to procure a lot of product that they maybe didn't even need. We were actually able to provide modeling to show, you know, here's what we anticipate you might need. And they were able to kind of procure with some of that knowledge and analysis. So, you know, the earlier on we can be, you know, brought to the table to support, you know, I think we can really help to improve outcomes as it relates to some of these challenges we're existing.
I can add one more perspective medically. Because medical affairs and BD is in every country where we are, we can reach out to our global medical affairs counterparts and look at, and that's where a lot of my information is coming from Italy or from China or from the United States, in every jurisdictions to understand why the difference in rates. So, you know, I complement the question about how can we get involved. You know, we are with you every step of the way. We are, you know, with you at night. We're in every part of your hospital. Just call us. You know, we have a common ground, which is the patient safety, and look forward to helping.
That's great, thank you. There's a question, well, don't mute your mic yet, John. There's another question for you. What's your best scenario for a successful vaccine?
Wow, that's a tough question. What's the best scenario? Let's put it this way. If I take the framework of timelines, we'd like to have a vaccine within the next 6 to 12 months. Number two, we'd like to have a vaccine for everyone that can be distributed to marginalized and also every community in Canada, irrespective of where they are geographically, and everyone in the world. I think that is access to care. And number three, I go with Chelsea's comment, which is we need to really help educate and diminish the concerns related to vaccination. Because if we put this in perspective, you know, I've already mentioned about the contagion and its impact and also the risk factors. We currently right now don't have a virus or a medication to manage COVID-19. So that would be the best scenario, which is the ability to produce a vaccination, distribute it globally, and obviously have everyone accept the vaccine. Now, there may be some underlying concerns. We understand that with every group of individual, but again, that acceptability and access to care, irrespective of the geographic location of an individual worldwide, would be the best scenario.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I see a pattern in the thinking in this webinar, as well as in others, is the building of relations, communications about vaccines, about partnerships before the crisis happens. So establishing, you know, the industry and healthcare partnerships and collegiality before it happens, so that the relationships exist before you absolutely need in the crisis. And there's a lot of learning going on. Sorry, Jennifer?
No, I was just agreeing with you. I think really critical. And I think, you know, we anticipate potential surges or, you know, next waves. So having that foundation now, I think will just make us so much more effective should there be another wave.
I want to say thank you to John, Jennifer, and Chelsea for today's webinar and for the work that you're doing to support the Canadian health system. I could see through that there's a caring element through what you've shared and what you've presented that is very valuable. So thank you for that. To the participants today, thank you for your time and commitment to lifelong learning, in particular during these worrying and flustering times. And my hope is that participating in webinars such as this, the college can support you as you navigate the expectations placed on you as a health leader in our Canadian system, and hopefully contribute in some way to you maintaining the balance that you need in your lives, because we're all running on high octane right now. So thank you and take care.